Hello, everyone. Welcome to Chrononauts, a science fiction literature history podcast. I'm Gretchen, and I'm joined here with my co-hosts JM and Nate. How are you both doing tonight?
Hey, really good. Really good. Had a pretty good week and went to my first loud guitar music show and been trying to get some work done and enjoying the reading for this podcast, which is pretty strange, but also returning to an old favorite, which is something that sometimes I like to do but don't do often enough. So,
And just to clarify, you mean that the material itself for this episode is strange, not that it's a strange thing that you would enjoy the reading for the podcast.
oh no, I do mean the material is definitely, it goes into some weird territory, and I imagine will prompt some interesting discussions because the whole spirituality and life after death thing is something that still fascinates people. So
yeah, absolutely,
yeah.
And that it's going to play a big part into this episode.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I've been doing pretty good too. It's been a busy couple weeks for me, but I've also seen some live guitar music that was unexpected. One of my wife's friends were in town, so we went up to Brooklyn for a bit, and had some fun. I saw Kraftwerk last week for some loud electronic music.
Oh,
so
nice.
That was a lot of fun too.
Yeah, how was that?
Yeah, it was great. Yeah, they put on a really great show with a cool 3D light show and all that. So
yeah, they do the kind of visual presentation as well. They like to do something a little special depending on what city they're going to, like pay a little tribute to it and so on. I think when they did the show in Montreal last, I guess it was pretty recently as well, I guess they had the view of the city from like outer space projecting when they were playing Space Lab or something like that.
Yeah, they did the same thing here, yeah.
Oh, cool. Yeah. That's pretty awesome.
No, it's fun though, but yeah, it'll be cool to be talking about these stories tonight because I think we have a really good bunch coming up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I've been doing pretty well too. I've been doing some editing of someone's book. One of my friends of the family is writing a book, and I've been sort of helping him edit it and look through it. So that's been pretty fun. I did have to kind of put away some other reading that I've been doing, but I still was able to get to these books, these works that we'll be covering tonight, and I also am looking forward to the discussions of all of them.
Yeah, and we're certainly going to be enlisting you for some more editing work in the next episode when we do an original translation.
Yes, that'll be interesting for sure.
Yeah.
So I, briefly just talking about what other stuff we've been reading, I actually read Jean Rey's book Malpertuis between this episode and the last one. My first exposure to him was the story that we did earlier this year.
Yeah, it was great.
Which is the Mind Salter. And then I read a whole bunch of short stories, which I think is something that I mentioned last time. And this is his only official novel, I guess, under that name, although he did all those weird Sherlock Holmes pastiches and stuff, which I guess are sort of, some of them are maybe a little longer, I'm not sure. But anyway, this was a really bizarre gothic tale that took a pretty odd turn into left field. And it's interesting because it also concerns a very strange house and the things that go on in it, which is the subject of one of our stories tonight.
Yeah.
The way it turned, it again, made me wonder how, if he was aware of William Hope Hodgson at all, who is one of our writers tonight. So that was kind of cool. I really enjoyed that. I'm sad that there isn't really anymore. But yeah.
Yes, I definitely want to read Malpertuis myself sometime soon.
Yeah, perhaps we could squeeze it in on the podcast.
Yeah.
It's not very SF, but we kind of tend to do things like that. So it might be. I've been thinking we should just do episodes every now and then where one of us just picks something really awesome that we like and everybody reads it. I think that would probably be pretty fun. So, yeah, Nate, have you been reading anything interesting? Besides, you mentioned it a couple months ago that you were getting a bit more reading in, but I know you've also been pretty busy with work and stuff. So
yeah, so this time around, I've been listening to the audiobook version of Moby Dick, read by Anthony Held, which is awesome. It's really cool to reread this, especially with a narrator that just gets really into all the characters. And Melville's prose is incredible. A lot of the scenes in the book really are mundane, but the way they're written feel just so intriguing, and he really sucks you in. And then when big dramatic stuff does happen, I just got to the part where Ahab offers the bag of gold for anybody that could kill Moby Dick. Oh man, it's just really incredible stuff.
Yeah, I've been reading that as well, very slowly reading that. So It is going slow, but I'm enjoying it. It's not something I really want to rush through.
Yeah.
So, but yeah.
Yeah, and I've also been reading Elizabeth Gaskell's North and South, which I'm almost to the end of, and I've been really enjoying that too. It's a more English social novel, kind of in the vein of like Hard Times by Dickens, if you've read that. Really good. Getting through a little slower than I wanted to, but should be done with that in a week or so.
I've heard of her, but I haven't read any. I have a collection of her short stories, I think. I think they're mostly classified as Gothic tales. I don't know, but they sound cool anyway.
Yeah.
I haven't read North and South, but I have read Wives and Daughters. I read that a couple of years ago.
Cool. Yeah, North and South is the only one I've read by her, but I also have Cranford and something else on my bookshelf, which I don't believe is Wives and Daughters. I'd have to check, but I think it's one of her other novels. Yeah, no, good stuff. I wouldn't call this one Gothic at all. It's more of your English social novel.
Yeah, you said it's social.
Yeah, right. But I certainly wouldn't mind reading a good ghost story by her. What about you, Gretchen? You been reading anything else other than podcast stuff?
As I had mentioned last episode, I am still in the middle of A Light in August, which I had to put down a bit. I still have about 50 pages left of that, but I've been really enjoying that.
It's a really dense book too, so it's not one of those you could just tear through in a day or two.
Right. Yeah. It's one of those you definitely have to take slower.
Yeah, for sure.
But it's really good. I have loved As I Lay Dying by Faulkner, so I'm really glad to finally be getting into more of his longer works. I don't know where I'm going after this. I do have The Sound and the Fury, so I might read that. I might take a break and read something else. Still trying to decide.
Yeah, Sound and the Fury is really good. Again, dense, but definitely worth it.
Mm-hmm.
So talking about racing through, I have definitely... My racing through is usually short stories. So that's kind of at the end of the night kind of thing, or maybe early in the morning, just try to get in a short story or two. And I mentioned John Shirley, I think last time. As well as reading more of him, I just decided a few days ago, because I was feeling a little bit frustrated, that I wanted to read something sort of raunchy. So I picked up a book of short stories by this dude from New Jersey named Brian McNaughton. And this was published in the early 2000s. He died in 2004, I believe, in his late 60s, but he seemed to really hit his stride in the 90s and 2000s with various stories, as well as publishing some really lurid horror paperbacks in the 70s. And I read his book, The Throne of Bones, before, and it's kind of like Clark Ashton Smith, but way trashier. It's kind of fun. It's like this decadent fantasy setting and stuff, and there's lots of ghouls and undead things and weird deviant sex acts and stuff like that, and all kinds of... It's well written. But this other book has some more contemporary stories in it, and it's interesting. The quality of the stories varies a lot. Some of them are really short. I sometimes find those to be the best ones. And one interesting one that I read that sort of... would be connected back around to the podcast is it's a take on Hoffman's The Sandman, but definitely does its own thing with it, but the references are very direct, very clear that that's what inspired it. It's kind of ridiculous and hypersexualized, but at the same time it's pretty good. So yeah, it's kind of interesting. His influences are pretty diverse, I guess, but range from even mentions Algernon Blackwood in one of the stories, which is somebody we'll also be covering tonight.
Yep.
So speaking of that, maybe we should get on to this house that's on the Borderland.
Yes. Before we get into the podcast, let me just say, you can find Chrononauts on all major podcast platforms, Spotify, Anchor, and Apple. We have a blog spot at chrononautspodcast.blogspot.com, where you can read a number of texts and translations. You can also follow us on Twitter at ChrononautsSF and Facebook at facebook.com/chrononautspodcast, or email us at chrononautspodcast@gmail.com. I have been practicing that just for this moment.
Yeah, I wasn't going to take it away from you. I just forgot that we hadn't actually gone there yet. It is a good thing to always bring this up in every episode so that people know what the hell they're listening to and where they can find our stuff.
Yeah, and especially take a look at the blog spot, because we have 2 new stories posted for you. One we'll be covering next time. It's in rather rough draft form. Amato Nervo's The Soul Giver. And one that is dear to my heart anyway. I mean, we won't be covering it for a while, but it is Renato Pestriniero's A Night of 21 Hours, probably better known as the short story that became the Mario Bava film Planet of the Vampires.
And I think we mentioned that film in the last episode.
Yeah.
Like a couple of times. So, yeah, that was a hint that it is coming. I don't know if you knew that it was based on a short story, but I certainly didn't.
No.
So,
but yeah, really cool. If you love the film, this is a great contrast piece. They're up on the Blogspot now, so if you have interest in either of those, check them out.
fierce hunger reigns within my breast. I had not dreamt that this whole world, crushed in the hand of God, could yield such bitter essence of unrest. Such pain as sorrow now hath hurled out of its dreadful heart, unsealed. Each sobbing breath is but a cry. My heart strokes knells of agony. My whole brain has but one thought, that nevermore through life shall I, save in the ache of memory, touch hands with thee, who now art not. Through the whole void of night I search, so dumbly crying out to thee, but thou art not. And night's vast throne becomes an all-stupendous church, with star bells knelling unto me, who in all space am most alone. And hungered, to the shore I creep. Perchance some comfort waits on me from the old sea's eternal heart. But lo, from all the sullen deep, far voices out of mystery seem questioning why we are apart. Wherever I go, I am alone who once, through thee, had all the world. My breast is one whole raging pain for that which was, that now is flown into the blank, where life is held, where all is not, nor is again. We've covered William Hope Hodgson on Chrononauts before. We did his stories, The Derelict and The Voice in the Night. And there was some extensive background that went into that as well, where he sort of talked about his life and so on. So I'm not going to get into that this time, but if you are interested, definitely we recommend that you listen to that episode, which was centered around sea stories. And you can find out a lot more about him from that.
Yeah, that is episode number 23.1.
So listen to that if you want to find out more about Hodgson and what kind of life he led and how his literary career was, like many others of his time, unjustly cut short during the First World War. But the book we're talking about tonight is House on the Borderland, which is his second published novel. Possibly third written, though. There's a lot of evidence that seems to suggest that The Nightland, which was definitely his weirdest novel, was written first, or at least begun first, but published toward the end in 1912. This one was published in 1908 by Chapman and Hall, and it is a rather famous work. It's probably maybe not up to the level of a couple of the Wells works we did, or maybe Lovecraft, but it's definitely one of the more prominent things that we're talking about on this podcast so far. And I know that it has a lot of fans that I've had discussions with before, influenced a lot of things, as I think everybody will be able to see when we talk about the summary. We summarize the work, and then afterwards we'll talk a little bit about what we think might have taken elements from this story. But for those who are just joining us, what we decided we were going to do is start by generally talking about the work and our feelings about it before we get into a synopsis, which will include all spoilers, pretty much. So if you are interested, let's just generally talk about how we feel about this work. So this is a reread for me. This is my third or fourth read of this book, actually. So I kind of feel like I have a connection with it, I guess, in a way, just because it's so familiar to me now. And it's still a pleasure to read, though. I mean, coming at something like this every few years is a different feeling, and it certainly feels different than it did the first time. I certainly notice a lot more, I guess, in a way. But I think it's the first read for both of you guys.
Yep, for me.
Yes, it is. For me as well.
So what was your general impression? I think we talked about this a little bit already, and I think everybody pretty much liked it.
Yes, definitely. As I had mentioned in the last episode, this was a work that I had been meaning to read for quite a while, and I definitely am glad to have read it. I really enjoyed this work.
Yeah, I thought this was great. It has a lot of stuff going for it in the sense that in some ways it feels like the structure is similar to Poe's The Narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym, in that it feels like 3 or 4 different segments kind of stitched together, but the stitching feels more natural than Pym. Pym just kind of suddenly, abruptly shifts at points where this feels like it has better flow. But each of the segments, I think, has something really unique and cool to offer the reader, especially if they're a fan of the weird fiction type stuff we've been covering the last couple episodes, because this fits very well in with that in terms of strange biology in the form of otherworldly creatures, as well as the strange future of the universe itself. Like, it really has some incredible far future predictions that we see every now and then in works from this time period. Like, there's a bit at the end of The Time Machine, but a lot of this science fiction, it feels smaller in a sense that it is concerned with like the future goings on of Earth, or things that people are doing like on this planet at this point in time with maybe some slightly different technology or whatever. This has a very galactic scale to it that I think is just really, really incredible and powerful in a lot of ways.
And yeah, then going back to what you said about the episodic nature of it, although I think that it is that, and it's pretty clear where the delineation lies, and I think everyone pretty much points that out who talks about this work, but I think that it fits together rather well, and I don't know if it's just rereading it or what, but I feel like, and I want to get to this more towards the end after we do the synopsis, but I think that some of the comments that people have made about this book, including prominent literary figures like H.P. Lovecraft and Terry Pratchett and Everett Breiler, who wrote the science fiction The Early Years Compendium, which sort of describes, I don't know, several thousand Victorian / Edwardian era SF works, are a little bit unfair towards this work. I'm not here to say that it's perfect, but I think that it fits together better than what they say. And I think one of the things that they complain about is not really a fair complaint, in my opinion. So we'll get to that, though. So I'm assuming that everybody thinks that this, like, can see that this is an influential work, not just in terms of the weirdness, but in terms of this cosmic scale. And I think that makes it worth, I guess, studying from a science fiction perspective.
Yeah, I think some of the prominent authors you mentioned, Lovecraft and Clark Ashton Smith, have specifically name-checked this work as something they enjoyed and have read. And I think it's a pretty clear line from one to the other. I mean, this does predate Weird Tales by about 20 or so years, but I think you can see that with the American authors reading a work like this, it's not that far of a stretch to get from that to there.
Right. It's also been praised by Guillermo del Toro. I've got a lot of good things to say about it, and Hodgson in general. We brought that up when we talked about The Voice in the Night and the Japanese film adaptation Mantango.
Yeah, the English title is like Attack of the Mushroom People or something like that, which is
right.
probably not in the spirit of the original, but I quite like the title.
Might not be the most faithful adaptation, but
yeah, but sometimes that works. The whole poetic literary flair.
Yeah, it's the same deal with Planet of the Vampires, and it kind of we have to get the sensationalistic title in there to bring people in, right? And of course, there's also Roger Zelazny, who's another later than the heyday of Weird Tales, American writer, who I think we've possibly talked about a little bit on the podcast before, but we never. I'm not sure where we're going to fit in something by him, but we might at some point, like Lord of Light or something, which won the Hugo and is really good science fiction work. But he also wrote a book called The Changing Land, which incorporates elements from this story pretty clearly. So it's highly influential, obviously, and so I think that makes it of interest. One thing I really noticed about the work this time around that I didn't notice necessarily as much when I was reading it in my 20s is just how damn melancholy it is.
Yeah, well, we'll get to that at the end, because I have quite a bit to say about that. But yeah, there's a feeling of, well, you heard the poem before this segment, of grief that just runs through the whole thing. And again, we'll get to that during the spoiler discussion, but I think that's one of the driving motivating factors for him writing this novel.
Oh, definitely. And certainly the writer of the manuscript that we'll get to. But I think a lot of the stuff in here is fairly clear. There's certainly some ambiguity and some things that maybe aren't fleshed out that much, but they don't really have to be. There's definitely a sort of cosmology that he's setting up here, and I think it works pretty well. And there's even a sequel story, should you choose to read the Carnacki Tales, which sort of over explains a lot of this stuff, and I think it's a little bit too much, a little bit too... We're actually going to get to that later on in a couple of months, maybe. But for now, let's not spoil it with any of that, because it is very explicit in its explanations, and I think it goes a little too far in demystifying it, although it feels a lot more like science fiction as well, so there's that side of it, I guess. But we all like the fact that weird fiction doesn't always provide rationalizations and very clear explanations for everything. Kind of like when we talked about the Mind Salter, we could speculate about a lot of things. And that's part of the joy of it, is that it leaves things open to speculation about the motivations behind certain actions and characters and things like that, and why certain things happen.
And I guess we talked about genre on the podcast before, and Hugo Gernsback's approach to amazing stories and the science writing and things like that. But, one of these issues that I've been thinking about with respect to other art forms like music and things like that, but it also applies to some of the literature starting around this time, is the difference between the artist and the engineer. And somebody like a Gernsback was very much an engineer. He had this whole publishing empire of electronics and radio publications and stuff like that. And I think he really liked over-explaining the science and the engineering and exactly what is happening at every moment in time, down to specific, precise scientific accuracy. And, sometimes that just misses the point of the story. Sometimes there's poetry in not knowing all that stuff. Sometimes what the important part is not how it happens, but the fact that it does happen, So I think somebody like a Hodgson, especially in a story like this, it is better where he doesn't spell out exactly the mechanics of behind everything or what everything is supposed to mean. Now, I haven't read that Carnacki story, so I don't exactly know where he's going to go with it. And when we do that one in a few months or whenever it is, I'll certainly be interesting to find out. But I get the feeling from, especially the way you're phrasing it, that the experience is probably going to be similar to the Verne Poe comparison that we had on the Arctic Adventure episode, where, okay, that's one direction you could take the story, but why would you,
Yeah, it's maybe not quite that egregious, just because it is written by the same person with probably the same ideas in his head. So I think it's a lot more congruent, but it's still not as pleasurable, mostly because a lot of it is Carnacki, the ghost finder, as he's called, just sort of explaining in a big exposition dump everything. That's and it's just, oh god, I liked House on the Borderland when it was just this weird, sad hermit living in his house, not really knowing what the hell was going on, but just seemed more mysterious that way, and I liked it better that way. But we'll get to that. So we'll be sort of revisiting through a side path the house on the Borderland. Yeah, so unless one of you guys has something else to add, I think we'll jump into the synopsis then.
Yeah, read this book. That's
I mean, we want you to read this book.
This one is definitely a strong recommendation from all of us. I'm sure all of us agree with that.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, pause the podcast if you haven't read this and go read the book and come back. This book contains 2 poetry excerpts. There's the grief poem, which we mentioned earlier, and which was a reading at the beginning of the episode. So hopefully everybody kind of gets the context now. There's also the Shoon of the Dead poem, which prefigured our last Hodgson episode. So that Shoon of the Dead is in all my editions at the front, just the beginning of the text before the introduction. And the book has a subtitle, which is From the Manuscript Discovered in 1877 by Messrs. Tonneson and Barragnog in the ruins that lie to the south of the village of Creighton in the west of Ireland, set out here with notes by William Hope Hodgson. So obviously what we're seeing is going to be purporting itself to be a true account, or at least the account of something that was found several years before the book was actually published. The book itself is dedicated, very simply and without flash, to William Hope Hodgson's father, who tread the lost eons. And I thought that was interesting because from the biographical information that I read about William, he and his father did not get along. So it's kind of interesting that was a decision that he consciously made. We'll never know what he meant by that.
Yeah, I mean, human relationships are complex, you know?
Yeah. It's really fascinating, and sort of, in a way, I think it even adds to the haunting quality, just knowing that there was some tumultuous relationship behind this, in a way, as well as, of course, the descriptions of grief from the character in the book. But so it purports to be the manuscript given to Hodgson, with some commentary appended as well, and a description of how the manuscript was discovered, provided by this Barragnog person. Hodgson promises revelations and wonder, and he makes metaphysical and spiritual speculations about what the manuscript, which he seems to take to be a true account of a singular man's experiences, reveals about the cosmos and the afterlife. Heaven and hell, specifically. The manuscript book itself is described as being slightly battered and water damaged. It has a musty smell about it, and I really like this introduction. It doesn't say too much, and it doesn't go into too much speculation, but it really sort of puts the mood forward about what you're going to experience, and I especially like the way he describes how the book feels and smells. It's really an interesting device.
Yeah, the librarian in me really enjoys the old book talking.
Yeah. And he also talks about the style of book and kind of apologizes for the manuscript, which he several times describes as stiff and abrupt in tone, which is something that people have leveled against Hodgson himself as a writer. So, I don't know, just a bit of meta-commentary apology going on there, but...
Yeah, I don't know. I would not say that applies to this novel. I had no problems with the prose style whatsoever.
Oh, yeah. Me neither.
Yeah, I think it's very fitting. There's some really marvelous descriptive passages and some powerful emotions, and I am going to pull out a couple of quotes later, but the book does begin, or the manuscript, which we're not ready to get to yet, but it does begin sort of like that, and I can kind of see what he's getting at, but I think it sets the tone for who this person is who's telling us the story. But we'll find out about the protagonist of the manuscript in a little while. In the meantime, Hodgson says, he says, lest you think this is some kind of serious screed, he also promises thrills and chills. So this is a kind of inviting the reader to step in. It kind of reminds me of one of those old radio hosts from like Suspense or something like that. So in the collected ebook edition of the collected works of Hodgson in 5 volumes from, I believe it's Nightshade Press, the grief poem prefigures the finding of the manuscript section. And I think this was different than the other book editions that I have, which have it at the back.
Yeah, I read the one on Gutenberg, and it was at the end.
Okay.
Yeah, I read the Delphi Classics, and it was at the end as well.
So, I mean, and obviously the placement, maybe, I don't know if it was an editorial decision to put it first in the ebook version or not, but I think that it sets the tone really well, and it fits at the beginning. So I like the fact that even though there's already a poem at the beginning, it really helped actually me to put this in the perspective that, yeah, this poem should be at the beginning because this is the whole reason why we're here. And it was found glued to the flyleaf, says Hodgson, and looks like it was written earlier. So, for now, in the west of Ireland, on a desolate spot by an unnamed stream that doesn't appear on any map, lies the village of Creighton. Here, 2 men, Tonneson and the only once named Barragnog, Holiday, as Tonneson thinks that the fishing is good. He's on one of those walking tours things that used to happen. It used to be a thing that I guess younger, well-to-do men in Britain would do. They just walk around everywhere and visit all the places and spend several months walking through England. Well, I guess Ireland in this case. But they set off 40 miles from the nearest train station. And the villagers only speak Gaelic here. Here it's called pure Irish. And they seem naive and curious. After nearly a week of catching, they decide to go for a hike instead, following the river downstream. And everything is quite pleasant until the river suddenly disappears into the ground. How'd that happen? And they wander on and hear what sounds like the roar of a waterfall beneath their feet, as the area becomes unexpectedly verdant. There's a fine mist in the air, and the area seems like it was once cultivated, but now has gone totally wild. And despite the verdure, the place has an air of desolation about it that starts to get to them. Just beyond the trees, they find a huge, yawning chasm from which a subterranean torrent seems to rage continuously, the origin of a visible column of ascending mist. It's bewildering and uncanny somehow, as it roils dozens of feet below them. On the other side of this fathomless gulf is some sort of rubble, and it looks like the remains of a building. So they pick their way around the circular abyss to investigate. There's a tongue of rock that juts out into the chasm, and the house, or whatever it was, seems like it was built on that. Despite all the masonry scattered about, there is surprisingly little of the building left. It's Tonneson who finds the manuscript in the rubble. The book is old and tattered, but mostly legible, except where some pages are destroyed near the end. North of the chasm is a lake of still silent water, except for a place from which there are bubblings and gurglings. Is it a link to the giant underground waterfall? Well, let's find out. So then out of the wood, there's a sudden, eerie wail. And I got flashbacks here to the ghosts of Starkness in A Voyage to Arcturus.
Yeah.
Quite similar. The men are spooked and make a hasty retreat, practically stumbling over each other to get away. And they're silent until well clear, and then speak about feeling vile things shadowing them in the woods. Some hours later, they get to the tent, and Sitting down to dinner, they agree that Baragnog should read the manuscript aloud. So commences the tale of the house on the borderland.
Yeah, this intro part here was a really great way to set it up. It kind of leaves you with the sense of expectation of mystery going forward.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I really like this opening portion. And it was especially cool that they set it in a part of Ireland where English is not spoken, which kind of added to the difficulty of getting around.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
It kind of reminds me of, it didn't really go that far, but it reminded me of that movie, And Soon the Darkness, where these British girls are holidaying in France and none of them can speak French. And they're in this little town and there's some murderous shenanigans going on and they just can't communicate with anyone. And that's kind of part of the suspense and the horror is you feel like everybody knows something that they don't. And there's no communication at all. So
yeah. Reminds me, JM and I remember when we were talking about, sort of joking about the genre of something called tourist horror, where it's like a stranger in a strange land coming across something horrible, but they also are like isolated from the rest of the community as well. Kind of fits in here too, I think.
Yeah, definitely. I don't think he picks up on the language issue in the actual manuscript itself, though. I mean, the manuscript is obviously written in English. I mean, it's not like these guys can speak Irish and would be able to make any heads or tails out of written Irish.
I don't think he speaks Gaelic either, actually. I think he just wanted to move there because it's so isolated.
Yeah, right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But there are some interactions he has with the villagers, or at least, like, it has a reputation for being strange. So I don't know. Maybe he forgot about that issue or something. I don't. But then again, there is the implication that the manuscript is set like centuries prior to it being discovered. So maybe the geopolitical landscape of this part of Ireland was slightly different at that point. I'm not exactly sure.
Well, we'll get to that. I don't think it was centuries. I think it was probably maybe 50 or 60 years. But
yeah,
we'll get to that because that comes up at the end. So, but I'm going to actually read how the manuscript begins because I love this. This sets the tone so well. And this is our first glimpse of the old man who's telling this story. He says, I am an old man. I live here in this ancient house, surrounded by huge, unkempt gardens. The peasantry, who inhabit the wilderness beyond, say that I am mad. That is because I will have nothing to do with them. I live here alone with my old sister, who is also my housekeeper. We keep no servants. I hate them. I have one friend, a dog. Yes, I would sooner have old Pepper than the rest of creation together. He at least understands me, and has sense enough to leave me alone when I am in my dark moods. I have decided to start a kind of diary. It may enable me to record some of the thoughts and feelings that I cannot express to anyone. But beyond this, I am anxious to make some record of the strange things that I have heard and seen during many years of loneliness in this weird old building. For a couple of centuries, this house has had a reputation, a bad one, and until I bought it, for more than 80 years no one had lived here. Consequently, I got the old place at a ridiculously low figure. So, pretty much, this is a recluse, and so he says anyway, a misanthrope. And we'll see if he's as much of a misanthrope or not as the narrator of Wuthering Heights. So our man lives in a bad house, and obviously it's been abandoned for a long time, and he wants to be isolated, presumably forcing his sister to live here with him. Strange things do happen in this grotesque house. The longer he spends in the house, the more he seems to notice the odd manifestations and presences, things more felt than seen. And here I'll suggest that it's the other way, too. The longer he stays, the more the presences notice him. The first really profound manifestation occurs on a night he insists on telling us was not Halloween. And this is kind of fun, too, so I'm going to read it. He says, "It was not Halloween. If I were telling a story for amusement's sake, I should probably place it on that night of nights. But this is a true record of my own experiences, and I would not put pen to paper to amuse anyone. No." Despite what Hodgson says about thrills and chills, our manuscript writer is very insistent that he's not doing this to amuse anyone. Indeed, it is a cold winter night after midnight when the dweller is first taken on an astral journey. The lighting in the room seems to change as Pepper grows frightened, and he is seemingly taken out of his body. At first he thinks noxious gas, which is sort of a funny conclusion to make, but
Yeah.
he can't move, and he feels sort of entranced and detached, but not enough to fail to be frightened. It's like being sucked through the wall. It's all very dreamlike in the way that it's written.
Yeah, the imagery here is fantastic.
Mhm.
This is a brief part and one of the little mini episodes, but this is definitely one of the best parts of the novel.
Yeah, it's just such a weird way to begin, right?
Yeah.
It's like, here I am in this house, and here I go out into space, which is basically what's happening. So on the other side is the vast silence of space. And at this point, I was sort of reminded of Fulci's The Beyond, with the plane of corpses.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, the ending. And the painting that was, I guess, there to guard the gateway. So now it does seem like he's being taken up, and the sun is a corona of white fire, and the earth a distant speck. And he descends over a vast red plain that goes on endlessly. And he seems to be on another planet, or in another dimension. There's a red, fiery ring on the horizon, with a black center. Our traveler seems borne inexorably forward, and there's a sense that perhaps time has passed, but also that our man is no longer subject to the dimension of time. He mentions an eternity passing, and I want to talk about eternity a little later, and what the conception of eternity actually might mean. But finally, the illimitable plain is broken by some colossal mountains which he is drifting toward. In the midst of the base of these interconnected mountains, a vast chasm yawns, and he is slowly pulled within. Huge, towering rock faces all around. The baleful red sun is dim. And he describes the layout he comes to as being like an arena. In the center of the giant circular arena stands a huge replica of his house, made with some green jade-like substance. Among the crags are figures. It's not clear if they are carven representations or not at this distance. They represent, though, various terrible mythological figures, like Kali and Set, and also things unknown and unfathomable. Gods of the future? Alien gods? Elder gods? He gets the sense they are alive, but in some kind of suspended trance. Could this be the immortality of the gods? But he's being borne again toward the great house. Around a corner comes a gigantic, luminous beast, walking upright and with the face of a swine. It is attempting to gain entry to the house when it looks directly at him, and for the first time in all of this, there is a sound. A booming note. A grunt, perhaps, or a voice. The face is terrible, and he is terrified. But swiftly, he is taken aloft, away, back, to the house in the world he knows. But is he marked? The red sun flares. He sees the creature looking up at him as he rises, a look of abject, all-consuming desire, the likes of which he has never seen in this world. The plane vanishes, leaving only mist. So, after passing through the solar system, he comes to in his study. Pepper is overjoyed that he's alive, and he feels dazed, confused, and very hungry. The clock shows just before midnight. He's been gone for nearly 24 hours. Apparently, he just hangs out in his study alone for days at a time, so this didn't alarm his sister, though she had the wisdom to put out the candles at least. So I guess he looked like he was asleep. But Pepper, though, maybe knew better. Behind the house is what the locals refer to as the pit. So there's time passing. A lot of time passes through this narrative. We don't quite know how long. Like, that's something else that I'll get to as well.
I think he typically specifies it's like a period of, I'd imagine, a few months, or even he mentions a couple years between some of the incidents.
Mhm.
Yeah, it's at least a year.
Yeah.
So it is January at this time that when all this begins, and later on he mentions it being November. But yeah, so and he's already been living in the house for over 10 years. So
Right.
these manifestations essentially they slowly build up over time. So he doesn't really go into what happened in the beginning stages, but I kind of imagine like small things happening, like weird noises and maybe odd dreams and stuff like that the first few years. And it just slowly, very slowly, is becoming more intense the longer he stays there.
Mhm.
So this pit is really a ravine with a slow-moving stream inside. And months after the arena vision, our man is walking with Pepper at the edge of this pit. And suddenly, some stones get dislodged and fall into the river with a crash. And Pepper starts getting agitated. Our man wants to explore, so he gets a stick, and then they creep their way down to the bottom, some 150 feet below. Down there's more disturbance, and Pepper attacks something after they hear a pig-like squeal. Pepper is wounded, and our man is mad, rushing into the bushes with his big stick and yelling. Something flees into the shadows. Pepper is tended to tenderly, and they return home. He doesn't tell his sister, Mary, what happened, blaming Pepper's condition on a wildcat. But it was no cat. We, the readers, and he knows, that it was a hog-like thing, a luminous white. That evening, after dinner, he's sitting reading and notices a swine-like thing peering into the window. It has glowing eyes and talon-like claws that resemble human hands. The webbed. He tries to get closer and it vanishes. So he determinedly goes out with a gun to hunt the thing. But just makes a lot of noise. Hey, what's the matter with you? His sister comes up and demands. Basically. Doesn't say that, but there's really no dialogue anywhere in this. This is all talking about events and things being described after the fact. She doesn't seem to quite believe the wildcat story for some reason. And he searches almost all day and is on the point of giving up, literally turning for home when he hears a stealthy sound and shoots in that direction. There's a scuttling and then nothing. And it's a good thing he prudently decides to lock all the doors, because that night, while he's restlessly up in the kitchen, something tries to get in at the back door. He sits awake all night, listening to unearthly shrieks from the forest. Or do they, in fact, come from the bowels of the earth? So, a week later, one evening, there's a crash from the pit as our man and his sister are outside. And lots of dust rises, and there's crashing and roaring down there. And then some swine things start to emerge. And our man, who's been keeping vigilant, fires his gun at them, apparently causing some mortality. But the creatures have emerged en masse and are charging at him. He screams to Mary to run for the house and follows her, braining one of the monsters, who falls with a nearly human groan.
Yeah, this part here really made me wonder if the creators of Minecraft had read this novel, because in Minecraft, you can construct a portal to hell, and when you get there, you see this enemy or this creature, the zombie pigmen, and they're normally just like wandering around going about their business, but if you accidentally hit one of them, they'll all rush to attack you like really fast.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
It appears to mirror not only this part, but also there's things you can do in the game, just building stuff, creating these structures of impossible geometry, but there's also lots of naturally occurring ravines and stuff. So there's certainly a fair amount of imagery contained in this book, like in the game, even though it's a sandbox game and you can kind of just do whatever you want with it. But it does make me wonder.
Gretchen, have you ever played Minecraft?
I haven't played it personally, but I do know a number of people who have, and I've seen them play it. And yeah, it's called the Nether, is where the zombie pigmen are. And yeah, like thinking about it, I definitely can see how that could have been inspired by this book.
Yeah, one of the game masters in one of the roleplay things that I do, he's talked about Minecraft before, and there are pig creatures in our setting. So maybe he's sort of taken it from that as well, which is kind of interesting. I didn't realize that Minecraft was so sinister. I thought it was kind of pretty laid back and chill sort of game. So
There's a bunch of monsters and stuff like that. But yeah, I mean, this is it's a pretty horrifying creature in the novel.
Mhm.
Just the imagery he has of these mysterious creatures that are making these awful sounds, and they probably smell really bad, and they're all really, really angry.
And they look hungry.
Yeah, and anything coming out of a giant pit in the ground probably isn't going to be good.
Yeah.
No,
And
no.
that image of the creature staring through the window definitely was quite eerie when I was first reading it.
Yeah, it's really effective. And what starts now is essentially a siege narrative. The house is under siege from these creatures.
Got to call in Patrick Troughton.
Yes. So all the doors are secured, but the creatures know what a door is right away, which makes our man clear of their intelligence. But he's convinced their intelligence is wholly malign and inimical to him, and indeed humanity as a whole. The swine things seem to be speaking a glutinous language. Mary has fainted, and when she revives with the help of some brandy, she seems afraid of him and runs to her room, barring the door. Then there's a noise from a room adjoining the kitchen, where there's one of the barred windows. A creature climbing up. He enters and sees the eyes looking at him and is hypnotized, as others seem to crowd around. It's only the fact that he burns his hand on the lamp he's holding that breaks the spell. He throws the lamp at the window, breaking the glass and spilling oil everywhere, which burns the creatures pressed against the pane. And it's here that we learn that he has a whole rack of firearms in his study, necessary for any survivalist loner, I suppose. And he resolves to go up into one of the house towers to do some execution below. But he can't see much. Every so often he hears noise from around, indicating that the siege is certainly continuing, but the swine appear to be holding a meeting of some kind, and there's much anger and agitation among them. The door from the study to the garden is weaker than the others, so the creatures gang up on that, and they're very canny about doing things like climbing up a water pipe later on to a vulnerable window. Our man nails up some boards just in time as they mass together and push to get in. He goes to the roof to do some shooting. And suddenly he manages to dislodge a piece of coping stone, and it's a big thing that falls among them. And several seem to be killed, and he sees one eating its fellows. So, in case you had any doubts about their malevolence, well, they're cannibals too, so...
Yeah, this part also kind of reminded me of Night of the Living Dead and the whole house under siege, shooting them off, getting to the secure location, boarding up the windows,
nailing boards to the door and everything.
Right,
and the zombies eating each other and stuff like that when they burn some of them. So now down to a window where one's breaking in. And he really has to do all of this himself, it seems. The next morning, all seems quiet. The bodies of the creatures he shot appear to be gone. That's strange. His sister is creeping about, and he also finds this strange, as if she should think it normal that he's running around, barring the doors and shooting at things.
Yeah, I do feel pretty bad for his sister.
Yeah.
During this part. It feels like it must be just really horrifying for whatever she thinks is going on.
Right, and he's pretty, cold toward her character and her feelings, and I think even at the end he sort of acknowledges that he's been like that, and it's kind of one of the sad things about the way things go in this story. I won't spoil it yet, but I think he's aware of this. But we don't know how much she really sees or knows of what's going on. He actually carries her kicking and screaming up to her room like a child, and Pepper's hanging out with her now, by the way. He's still feeling pretty sick from his wound. So he locks his sister in her room and waits the night through, but it's quiet and still. Walking about the quiet house, our man finds himself in the cellars, a near catacomb of mysterious and large underground chambers. The weirdest in the house, he calls them. It's cold and dark and drippy down there, and he barely remembers his way around.
At least he has some brandy with him, though.
Yeah. He makes a circuit of the place and almost trips over What's this? It's a ring in the floor. Yes, indeed. It's an ancient trapdoor. He gets it open, and no steps, just smooth descent. Bottomless seeming. And listening, he hears a chuckling from down there. He manages to secure the trapdoor and goes upstairs. Mary is fine, and Pepper slowly seems to be getting better. Does Mary believe in anything that's happened? She refers to the wildcat. Now, out in the gardens, Pepper joins him, and they find the outside of the door covered in scratches, seeming to indicate the reality of all that's happened. But none of the killed creatures, including the crushed ones, are in evidence. Determined to check the pit, he finds the topography has changed. No longer a ravine now, but a chasm with a stagnant lake, water running from somewhere to the east. Sound familiar? It's like there's been an earthquake. Down in the new pit is a hole that he thinks leads into the bowels of the earth. The water level is steadily rising, so he resolves to take a look at it and climbs down with a rope. He hears echoes coming back to him, eerie and distorted and multiplied. Pepper really doesn't want him to go down there. But the dog decides better they go down together than he leaves the old misanthrope to go down alone. The path underground seems to curve right back around to the house, but is interrupted by a vertiginous drop into nothingness. There's a narrow edge, and he walks completely around a circle. Doesn't get to see much, though, before a torrent of water erupts into the space, flooding it very quickly, and man and dog barely get out alive.
More cave horror.
Right, yeah. And the very canny Pepper saves his life more than once. And they emerge into a massive downpour, which increased the water level in the lake, and effectively makes the pit unexplorable. So it's so much of an ordeal that he nearly leaves Pepper there as he stumbles back to the house. He lies ill for 3 weeks after this. His undyingly maternal sister tends to him. Back at the pit, everything is still. There's a great hole there that leads into the bottomless pit, from which odd sounds emerge. He has no doubt that the swine fiends came from down there, and likens its entrance to the pits of hell. The pit is also right under his own house. Yet there's an odd regret that it seems sort of sealed off now, and he'll never find out more. Oh, just you wait. He does remember the trap in the cellar, though, and decides to check out what it's like down there now. Indeed, there seems to be a roaring waterfall. So the cellar and the pit and the swine things are all connected. What about them, then? Did they drown? So, I'm going to read another quote, because I think this is good. This is what he says. And so, I suppose, the water goes on, thundering down into that bottomless hell pit. Sometimes I have an inexplicable desire to go down to the great cellar, open the trap, and gaze into the impenetrable, spray-damp darkness. At times the desire becomes almost overpowering in its intensity. It is not mere curiosity that prompts me, but more as though some unexplained influence were at work. Still, I never go, and intend to fight down the strange longing and crush it, even as I would the unholy thought of self-destruction. This idea of some intangible force being exerted may seem reasonless, yet my instinct warns me that it is not so. In these things, reason seems to me less to be trusted than instinct. One thought there is, in closing, that impresses itself upon me with ever-growing insistence. It is that I live in a very strange house, a very awful house, and I have begun to wonder whether I am doing wisely in staying here. Yet, if I left, where could I go and still obtain the solitude and the sense of her presence that alone makes my old life bearable? So, what's this? Whose presence? He never mentioned this before.
Yeah, Hodgson even points this out in a note that's like, I think, kind of sloppy the way he does it.
Yeah.
But, whatever.
Well, he's blaming it on the manuscript writer.
Well, I think this note is directly from Hodgson himself, not the manuscript writer.
No, I mean the note is I guess so. Yeah, you mean the fact of the insertion is sloppy.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I see what you mean. I mean, I guess in general that is sort of the case with the footnotes. They just sort of appear when I guess Hodgson feels they're necessary, or the writer, the pretend Hodgson, sort of, who's found the manuscript.
Right.
There's more of them later. This is the first one, and then there's one for a little while, but they start to appear from here on. And sometimes they're trying to elucidate something about the manuscript that might seem vague or strange, and I guess he wanted a way to introduce the reason for him staying in the house. But he also thought, oh, maybe some readers will be confused and start flipping back and wonder if she was ever mentioned before.
Right.
And she's not. So, I mean, I think it's fine the way he does it in the manuscript, actually. I don't really think an explanation is needed.
No, especially because you find out who she is, like, very shortly.
Yeah. So I think this is cool because often in horror stories, right, when people get into these sort of situations and they are in these sort of bad places, everybody always says, well, why don't you just leave? Why don't you just go? Right? And there's usually an explanation, but it's often a not great one. It's like, well, I could win $1 million if I stay here, right? It's kind of like sort of uninspired, right? Yeah. And people really do criticize Hodgson a lot for the romance elements in his stories. And I've noticed that in almost all the criticism of Hodgson's work. And he does this a lot. He does have romantic elements in his stories. There's usually a romance of some kind. In the Nightland, it's very prominent, and it's very it's not always great to read, admittedly, but here it's more in the background, obviously, because she's not alive. And that's the thing. She's been dead for some time, and he's so crushed by this that I guess this is basically, I mean, he was probably already kind of going that way, but this is pretty much the reason why he doesn't want to have any contact with the rest of the human race, because he's so sad and so crushed. And now he finds that it's actually good being here in the house, because he's about to relate the night he comes to the Sea of Sleep. He has another vision, and this time the room seems to slowly fade away, and he hears the sound of steady waves, and finds himself standing on the shore of a great, tranquil sea. The place is lighted by a globe of pale fire, like an alien sun. It's here that his love joins him, seeming to float within the sea, which may not indeed be water, for he can't enter it. Something prevents him. But she is able to reach out and touch him, and this thrills him. It's sweet, but at the same time, she says he should not stay in the house, for it is an evil place bounded by grim laws. But he won't listen. If this is the only place she can find him, here he'll stay. Evil things be damned. Now it's at this point the manuscript breaks off, becoming illegible, says our interpreter, William Hope Hodgson.
Yeah, I thought at first this was significant because perhaps this was the narrator's favorite passage in the manuscript, and he kept coming back to it and back to it to reflect on it, and that was the page that it was left open and was crushed by the masonry. But as we see later on, it turns out that may not be the case.
Yeah, I think also, in a way, it's hidden, authorially hidden because of what he saw.
Right.
And I think Hodgson doesn't want to go there. And I think, in a way, it could be temerity on his part, but it also makes sense because it's 1908. You don't want to totally challenge everyone's religious convictions for the sake of a novel necessarily, I guess.
Yeah.
And it would also be too obvious, because my interpretation of this is that he saw whatever guardian angel is in charge of this place. He even says, "Oh God," at one point. But we see fragments. We see fragments essentially of what was there, but there's not much to be read from this section. So it's kept hidden, which is interesting because, it's the one point of positivity, the tranquil resting place, the one moment of sweetness, I guess you could say. And we're not really able to see most of it.
In a sense, it adds to its otherworldly mysteriousness of the character herself.
Yeah. So whenever he travels, it's like he's speeding through space, toward or away from the solar system. So, returning to his body in the house, he feels the familiarity of the approaching solar system of planets and sun. Just, it's kind of interestingly described, like it's not a very sudden transition, it's very gradual, and it's almost like he is in fact moving through space. This is the part where the great sort of obvious, I guess, theme is, you could say. It seems like a lot of people really love the first half of this book, but have trouble with this whole section.
Oh, this section is like, for me, like the real reason to read this book. I mean, what came up to this point is really good and all, but oh man, this part is awesome.
I kind of agree.
Yeah, I really like this part as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe, I mean, the first time I read it, I did think maybe it was a little, like, painstaking. But I think each time I've read it, I've come to appreciate this whole thing more, because there's so much in here, and there's so much awesome cosmic description. It's like that whole end section of the time machine where the traveler goes to the end of the Earth's lifespan, but spread out for like several long chapters.
And way more dreamlike, a lot more metaphysical, like more spiritual connection, whereas like the traveler was like, oh shit, there's like these weird crabs, I got to get out of here. And it's just not like that here.
No.
Yeah, I actually read this part like in a very quiet, very dark room past midnight, and I feel like that also added to the atmosphere when I was reading this. And yeah, this part really stuck with me when I was reading it.
Yeah, that's pretty much the perfect environment for this. And I would like to find a good audiobook of this at some point. I'll have to poke around to see what's out there, but a good narrator could really, really do incredible justice to this part, because I think this is really dying to be read out loud and kind of acted out.
Yeah. Unfortunately, I did once have, it wasn't a commercial audiobook though, so maybe there is a better commercial reading of this, but it was one of the talking books made in the United States for libraries for the blind, and it was bad. It was really bad reading. Very unfortunate. Part of this wasn't perhaps the narrator's fault, but he just had this like New England kind of Bostonian sort of accent, I think, and it was really strange.
Yeah, no American accents for this book. It's got to be a British guy reading it.
Yeah, and he just didn't seem that invested in it. Like when he read the grief poem at the end, it was like he was reading a grocery list or something like that. It was just like not good. So yeah, I mean, I was kind of excited that there was one, and I was like, oh, cool, because I'd already read it, and I just kind of was curious to know what the audiobook sounded like, and I think I wanted to do a demonstration of a new digital book player that they just come out with.
Right.
So I'm like, oh, why don't I use this book? And I hated it so much that I don't think I even used it. I was just yeah. Now, more time passes, and this is at the point where he says it's been almost a year since the arena journey, but it could in fact be longer. So late at night, again, in the study with Pepper, reading the Bible this time. That book is starting to feel more significant somehow. There's a sudden tremor in the house, and the clock starts buzzing like a mosquito. The candles go out. Time is accelerating, as he realizes soon, from the rapid swinging back and forth of the sun. And it seems to be getting faster. So I'm going to be deliberately quick with describing some of this, but Hodgson really imbues it with quite a lot of cosmic power. Mm-hmm. There's so many sights and even sounds this time. He calls it the world noise, because everything is just going by so quickly. It's like a constant rush of sound. And he describes all the power of a gale and a rainstorm with thunder and lightning and everything, but in the space of just a few seconds. So he checks on his dog, who seems sleeping peacefully, but our man feels frightened and tries to rouse his only friend, and when he touches him, Pepper collapses into a pile of bones and dust. While he seems to remain relatively, but not completely fixed, everything around him, in fact, has aged. Dust and dirt is everywhere. An ancient and decrepit visage confronts him in the looking-glass. The furniture seems to be rotting before his eyes. He spares a thought for his sister, and thinks this must be the end of all things. The surroundings are changing around him, growing dark. The sunlight strange. His chair is remarkably intact, so he stopped pacing and torturing his ancient joints and collapses into it. Things tumble and collapse around him as he falls into a doze, and his cosmic journey has just begun. Awakening to a luminous sky out the window, with a vibration moving from north to south rapidly. He's been granted access to different time spaces, he says. He also hasn't withered to dust, apparently. The sense of cosmic vastness is, once again, huge. He tries to think of yesterday and realizes there's no such thing. Hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of years have passed. Something is protecting him somehow. And he walks across the room, the dust of eons deadening his steps. But wait, it isn't just that. The chair he fell asleep in is gone, and, of course, there is the impression of a human body, long, long dead amidst the eternal dust. It's remarkable the house itself has withstood this long, but even this ill-starred edifice has begun to crumble, slowly. Time now accelerates to such a rate, things seem to be standing still. He watches the sun grow old. He thinks often of his dog. The last day of the world approaches. Shades of dying earth here, like Jack Vance and The Nightland, which Hodgson himself wrote about the end of existence on the earth under a dying sun. The sun and its cluster of planets are being pulled through space. It's so cold, perhaps, that even he can feel it in his bodiless state. The rotation of the earth gradually slows, and now the sun looks like a red giant, with ominous dark patches in it, rising and setting again in the sky, huge and deadly. The stars a thinly glowing halo in the distance. They seem to be moving out of the familiar universe, in space as well as time. As high and as far as the eye can see, there's snow, eternal whiteness. Of course, really, it probably would not snow if this were really happening. And there needs to be enough temperature, enough heat in the atmosphere, I guess, for condensation to happen. And Hodgson actually seems to wonder about this in the suddenly very frequent footnotes, where he's sort of trying to come to terms with a scientific explanation of what the narrator is giving in the text.
I think there also might be issues of like the whole atmosphere getting discharged if the solar system has been rapidly shifted in one direction. There could be issues with that as well.
Yeah.
Never mind colliding with the sun or other planets or other things along the way.
Yeah, and I think like Hodgson is not, I mean, if this were H.G. Wells, he might be spending a little more time on this, but I think Hodgson is really more interested in the cosmic feeling and the sense of vast gulfs of space and time.
Yeah, and honestly, worrying about details like that just seem to be missing the point of this whole scene.
Right. So he also speculates about the moon falling out of the Earth's attraction, and Hodgson regrets that the narrator can't explain further. The baleful sun seems frightfully close, and then it finally sets, for the last time, jerks, and dies. The red giant starts to engulf the inner planets. Everything is dreadfully dark for a long time, but then slowly a green star is seen in the distance. They are being inexorably drawn toward this. A man feels the quickening of hope at the onset of a light, even a strange one. It draws closer, but is eclipsed by the sun. In the new gloomy tenebrousness, he begins to think of the pit, the swine people, and the thing that haunts the shores of the Sea of Sleep. Behold, though, light once again. The speed of time is decreasing, speculates the footnotes. Now, at the end of worlds, the padding of many feet, whispering sounds, the gleam of a multitude of eyes. Swine things! And he leaps out into the world through the space where a window once was. And in the dawning green luminescent glory, he sees legions of swine things crawling over the desiccated but still apparent structure of the old house. The green star hovers over the house, and the whole thing appears to ignite in fire, and then collapse into the earth, swine things and all. He thinks of the hell pit. Now the red giant swallows whole the earth. Our spirit still has a protector, it seems, and is taken aloft to observe the final death of the solar system. The green star, maybe, is the sun of suns at the center of the universe. Such speculation. And suddenly, our man doesn't feel alone anymore. The universe seems illumined by transparent spheres. He seems to see faces in some of them. The souls of the departed, perhaps? He is sucked into one of the globes and finds himself upon the sea of sleep. And there he meets his love once again, and they experience some moments of true, soul-bound happiness. But now there's a premonition of dread, a darkness. She warns of a dark sun and says she must leave, though there's a hint they may soon be together. But then, what is time in this eternal place? Still, the black sun approaches, and there's weird theological speculations here. Heaven and hell, stuff about a double star, a binary, messenger angels erupting from the green star, and flames from the black one. The presence near of the divine. So, let me run this by you. So at the end of time, or close enough to it, there seem to exist, so says this cosmology, two states of being, the sea of sleep and the plane of silence. And the latter is closer to the end of the universe, where tortured visages also dwell inside these weird spherical structures. And maybe the beings that live there, though through our perception they exist at some far, far future date, post-cataclysm, maybe they exist themselves in eternity. So the concept of eternity, as I've always understood it, some people think it means forever, like all time, stretching out forever. But I think what eternity is supposed to signify is the proper, I guess, idea of time as being something that's always there and always present. So instead of something stretching out before you, it's like almost like everything existing in one moment. I don't know. I'm trying to make sense of this sort of idea that these beings in eternity, they're in all times at once. So something like the house on the Borderland, which also seems to be, if not eternal, maybe close to it, seems like a good target for creatures like that. And obviously, they want entrance to this, just like, I guess, the demons of hell want entry into paradise. So it seems to be some kind of, he's going for some kind of really heavy theological stuff here, but he's kind of dancing around it in a way and not really addressing it full on, which I think is probably for the best, but it's pretty cool.
Yeah, and I do like how he does keep it vague. I mean, there is the sort of allusions to angels and heaven and hell and that kind of green and black binary construction, but in a way it feels not like the typical Christian view of apocalypse or eternity or the end of the world or anything like that. He mentions gods like Kali and Set earlier in the story, and
right.
Concepts of eternity here might be similar to like a Vedic Hinduism construction rather than something that you would see in Christianity.
Yeah. These seemingly, I guess, there's no mention of some of the more positive ones, but like seemingly the darker pagan gods exist in this sort of hell future as well.
Right.
And on the plane of silence, which seems to be a terrible place compared to the Sea of Sleep. And the creatures that live there are, I guess, the most active ones being the swine demons, are looking for a way out. And someone built this house on the earth. Now, one thing we never find out in the story is, what is the reason for the house being there?
Well, I assumed that it wasn't built on the earth. I assumed it was built in the hell arena, and for some reason linked with the Earth and manifested itself physically on our plane.
Right. Yeah, it doesn't seem to be... There's no house on the Sea of Sleep, so...
Right, but it seems to be made out of a finer material in the amphitheater. I think it just says like jade.
Yeah, it's described as a jade-like substance.
Yeah, whereas in the real world, it seems to be just basic stone masonry.
Yeah, it is a weird-looking house.
Yeah.
It's not described too much, but it definitely... It's kind of funny because I was reading Malpertuis just before rereading this, and it was kind of like similar weird towers and weird, like, designs in the stonework and stuff like that. And Jean Ray goes a lot more delightedly into the detail of just how grotesque his house is. But I was definitely sort of conflating the two in my mind.
Yeah.
I mean, well, in The Sea of Sleep, of course, the love of the manuscript writer is there. And that sort of stands as the contrast to the house on the plane of silence. And I think that maybe that's why they are both connected in a way. So even though it seems on Earth that only the house is there, it still remains the only connection that the writer has to her, which is why he remains.
Yeah, and she never manifests herself in the real world.
No.
She is only present in this kind of like astral state of being.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
I kind of wonder if Hodgson had read Flammarion, because it seems like Flammarion wrote a lot of stuff like this, though from all accounts and reviews, it's kind of clunky and goes on for way too long. But the descriptions...
We just keep coming back to Flammarion, don't we?
I know, yeah. I don't know if we're going to do him for the podcast, because I think we might have gone a little too past him, but I don't know. It just seems like from some of the descriptions that it would be along these similar lines, and certainly the thing we read from the Holmberg of Mr. Knickknack and things like that, while clumsy in itself, in a sense, is this other weird metaphysical voyage through space and all that.
Yeah, definitely some interesting parallels there. So, yes, the house is still in this future arena where our man once again finds himself, or our spirit, I should say. And guess what? The door has been forced, just like the outer study door in his house. And a giant coping stone has fallen, just where it did in his world. Everything is just kind of bigger and more silent. Except he can hear murmurs of swinish laughter as he floats toward a door that opens. Inside, there's a sudden eruption of terrible screaming sound, and he's put back in his room, in the present, in the study. He has an impression of the door closing, but no, he must be imagining it. In a moment of hope, he calls for Pepper, his dog. After all, he survived, and the house isn't full of dust and rubble, so maybe. But no, there, under the table, are the ashy remains of Pepper. And this chapter, in fact, is the shortest in the book, and it is just called Pepper.
Yeah.
Which is a nice touch.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like one page.
Yeah. It's really sad. It's like, you know, this is his only friend in the world. And we never get an explanation as to why he survives and the dog doesn't. It just happens that way, and he'll never know.
Mm-hmm.
But now he's uneasy, and he can't explain the premonition, but feels that death is very near. He's gotten a new dog from somewhere, so I guess he does go out sometimes. We don't hear anything about that, and the dog doesn't even get a name this time. And he chains him up outside the house, unlike Pepper. One night, a pad, pad, pad of footfalls in the garden. But what footfalls? The dog howls in fear, and possibly pain. And the cat, who we've never heard of till now, springs up onto the sill outside and backs away in fear. Our man's too scared to go out, and a hand, luminous with green fire, encircles the cat and burns it to death. Something is walking about in the night. It touches the dog and pads out of there, to the west gate, closing it. In the morning, there are no footprints, but the dog has a nasty wound and burn on its flank that looks to have been made by some kind of talon. He won't eat any food. and for the next 2 days remains listless and greedily drinks water. The wound glows in the dark. Then, again, the padding in the night. No more recourse to his rack of firearms, it seems, for this man. He sits there, awaiting his fate. Can't move, can't leave. Outside the window, the great swine lord from the arena. Now, as it turns toward him, the narrative turns present tense, for immediacy's sake. The eyes are described as inhumanly human. His mind is entrapped, and he is forced to unbolt the door, not just using his hands but his feet as well. But then faints just as the last bolt is almost withdrawn. The thing has been shaking the door all this time. So this was a really tense scene. It's not just what I've described. There's this whole description of his mental processes and how he's being forced to do things against his will, and aware of every second, but unable to change anything. And in the morning, he finds himself thinking of his sister Mary, seemingly for the first time, really, wondering how she's doing, why they have so little to do with each other. The dog is much worse, the wound larger, and having sprouted a fungal growth of some kind.
Yeah, Hodgson really likes his fungus.
Yeah, he definitely has a thing about fungus. I feel like that might be inspired by his time on the sea and food going bad and all kinds of crazy stuff.
Right.
Apparently it was part of his photography. He would take pictures of the rations and the horrible state that they were in. Just so, I guess, people who were not sailors could see what it was actually like on the sea and have it de-romanticized for them. It seemed to be one of his goals, even though he wrote plenty of rollicking sea adventures.
Yeah, this part and what we're about to discuss, and it definitely did remind me, especially of Voice in the Night.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, definitely. Yeah, the big time. And I hadn't read that, until we actually did the episode, I think. So it's kind of like, oh, okay, so that's where that came from.
Did that one come before that, or was that...
So The Derelict was written later. The House on the Night was one of his early works, so...
Yeah, okay, the Voice in the Night was before this one, yeah. 1907.
Okay. There is certainly a lot of uncertainty about the actual time in which a lot of this stuff was written for him.
Right.
Seems like the order is not quite the same as publication, but it's generally agreed that his writing actually became, I guess, less dominated by the weird as he discovered or tried to discover how to make some kind of commercial impact, except for The Nightland, which, again, sort of justifies, it was his last published novel, but it was just before the war happened, and it was the first one that he actually tried to write, and it was his weirdest, without doubt.
Right.
But the morning after being struck by the thing, the dog had licked his hand, and now it seems there's a scratch there, and it glows luminously. And as the hours pass, it grows. He shoots the dog and buries it. Prays uselessly to God. And after nearly a week of mostly sitting listlessly in his chair and eating nothing, his side is nearly consumed, and he knows soon it will eat into his face. And he says, I shall become a terrible mass of living corruption. So our lost, poor narrator thinks of the gun rack and suicide, and hopes God will forgive him. He sleeps a lot, and then he hears a creaking from below, and his hearing, oddly acute, picks it out as the opening of the trap door in the cellar. Something's padding up the stairs, and we know what it is. The manuscript breaks off in mid-word. Too late. Tonneson and Barragnog spent all night reading the manuscript, and they are disturbed, and they await the arrival of their driver, who I guess speaks Gaelic, and he manages to find an ancient who tells of the house, a horrible place that was known for evil back in old days, and how one day a man and an elderly woman had come to live there. No one visited them except he who brought them regular supplies. And one day this man showed up, and the house had vanished, replaced by a great, deep chasm. And that is pretty much how our story ends. So, is the house being gone now a good or a bad thing? I'm not unhappy that he didn't clarify this, but like you were saying, Nate, that you thought the house was built in this end of the universe underworld sort of thing, and that was where it existed initially, almost. I wonder about that. I mean, I wonder, is the house there to protect something, or to keep something out, or to keep something in? And now, presumably, the house being gone, what made that event come to pass? Did the narrator influence that somehow, or would that just have happened anyway? It seems like the house would have survived for a very long time, according to his temporal journey, anyway.
Yeah, that was my feeling, too. So, I don't know if they had built this portal thing in the Hell world to specifically send out for him by the pigmen, and once they got him, well, they didn't need it anymore, so it just let it crumble to dust or whatever. But it seems like the house's construction predates him moving there by centuries anyway, but maybe there's some, again, not the concept of eternity as like him being forever in the future, but forever of all time at once, some intrinsic link over all times, including the past, with the narrator and the house. Yeah, I don't know. It's a good question because it never really is expounded upon of how it collapsed or why or what the future of that area holds.
It certainly still seems to be a haunted area by some presences. And I mean, I kind of wondered if you all thought the framing device was necessary. I mean, it doesn't really add a lot, but at the same time, it is cool hearing about the manuscript and what the manuscript is like.
I mean, I definitely think it contributes at least to the mood of the story and, like, the tone. I really like that they have the framing device, even if it doesn't necessarily, like, answer or explain anything. I think it makes it more mysterious, and I kind of like that.
Yeah, I think it went on a little too long at the end. I think it could have made it a little shorter and punchier. But certainly the beginning framing device is great.
Yeah, I actually, maybe even Hodgson's introduction could have explained some of that stuff. Like,
right, yeah.
Almost. That would have been okay. Like, I don't think the ending talking about the elderly couple moving into the house, like, I don't think that really would have spoiled anything if we'd known about that in the beginning. Right? So, I don't know. I mean, it is what it is. Like, I'm not really complaining about it that much. I do think, yeah, like you said, Gretchen, the mood that it sets is really terrific. And I really like... I don't know, for some reason I really like it when they're, like, exploring the area and they find the manuscript and then things start to get really eerie in ways they can't explain. And they're just, like, rushing back to their campsite kind of feeling really spooked. I thought that was really cool. And it's kind of a nice prefiguring of what's to come, in that it will be really eerie and it will be kind of unsettling in ways you can't always describe.
Yeah, I mean, like, that kind of thing, is still kind of capitalized on in a lot of media with, like, found footage and everything like that, where you have, like, people stumbling across just odd documents of things going on like that. And I think that's always pretty cool.
Yeah, definitely.
So we were just talking earlier about other things that this reminded us of, especially the cosmic journey. And there was something that, Nate, you and I forgot to mention, which kind of I had actually put in my notes here. Marie Corelli and Romance of Two Worlds. Yeah. The narrator of that book goes on a sort of cosmic journey as well and gets to see what it's like on other planets and experience Jesus, the cable of electric Christianity or something. I don't know.
Yeah, it's equally bizarre, perhaps not as poetic and mystical. It definitely had more of a sense of lecturing than this one does.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely shooting for mysticism, but I was quite vocal about not really liking that book very much.
Yeah, this is much better, I would have to say.
It didn't have as much skill as Hodgson.
No.
No. I guess, though, it was interesting in that it also had this huge theological bent to it. And what Marie Corelli, who's obviously a believer in Christianity, is trying to, almost like she was trying to start this new movement of electric Christianity. Like, in an alternate universe, this was probably a thing and not Scientology. You know what I mean?
Yeah, right.
Like, it's like... Now, Hodgson, according to the biographical information, unlike his father, who was actually a Anglican minister, I believe, was not a believer.
Yeah. And I definitely got the sense from this because, like I was saying earlier, the apocalypse just doesn't vibe with the Christian eschatology. And
Right.
there's certainly competing theories for the end of the universe, like the big freeze and the big rip, and they didn't really exist when Hodgson was writing this, but he doesn't see the end of the world in the way of like the eternal life that Christianity describes, aside from maybe what lives in the pit in this universe. But it's this kind of intradimensional, like I don't even know how to have words to describe it. It just feels very different. The apocalypse feels much more universal and on such a
Yeah.
bigger scale that's just not confined to this planet or our species or our civilization, but just something much larger and, in a sense, much more horrible than anything that
Yeah.
is described in Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
It kind of makes me wonder, though, if, again, he dedicates this book to his dad.
Yeah.
So I wonder, I feel like because Hodgson was always like running away from home and stuff, they probably didn't sit down over tea and have a lot of theological arguments, but it must have been something in his mind, something that's kind of like refuting some of the things that his father would have believed in, I guess, maybe, or perhaps trying to find answers that he thought were better or more conclusive.
Yeah, I kind of wonder like how much he knew about astronomy and that sort of thing at the time because he does seem to frame this stuff in a very large scale. He's clearly aware of how like stars progress through their lifespan and the orbits of galaxies and solar systems and things like that. And he
Yeah,
does accelerate it millions of years into the future and kind of give projections of. Again, I don't know if he was up to the latest discoveries that they were making at the time. They certainly knew far less about the universe than we do now. But I mean, they certainly knew other stuff was out there in 1908, and the way he accelerates it, it seems like he was attuned to those kind of details.
well, there was certainly speculation about the sun becoming very aged and turning into a red giant, right?
Right.
At a certain point in time, millions of years in the future. I don't know how new that speculation was at that time.
Yeah, I'm not sure either. We only confirmed the Big Bang theory of the universe in like the 60s when they discovered cosmic background radiation. So
Right.
never mind all the stuff that we're still discovering with those super powerful telescopes that can look at planets in different solar systems and things like that through radio astronomy. But I'm pretty sure they had discovered the motion of like some of the larger objects in the night sky, as well as speculation of extrasolar worlds and stars of similar nature to the sun, but just like much, much, much bigger. And Newton's laws of gravity and stuff like that had been around for centuries. So it's just an
Yeah.
interesting application of that knowledge.
I mean, we know that even though Hodgson may not have had a strong scientific background, he was a journalist as well. And he would have just been somebody who was possibly interested in these kind of matters. And, again, it kind of leads one to speculate on if he had lived a little longer, what sort of things he might have written about in nonfiction as well as fiction. I was wondering, what do you guys think of the writer of the manuscript as a person? What do you think of him?
I don't know. It's just kind of hard to get a sense of his personality when we have these very strange events going on all around us. There's his relationship with his sister is kind of odd,
Yeah.
but he clearly has a very strong attachment to Pepper
Yeah.
and his dog, and I think that's possibly one of the reasons of this whole novel being a thing. Is it seems like a very extrasolar treatise on grief, extending it to not just the dogs, but quite a lot of things in the novel. We see the fungus as kind of a physical manifestation of grief, as the narrator ends up being consumed almost entirely by it. And it kind of makes me wonder if Hodgson himself had lost a pet in a way that he felt personally responsible for, like he was out hiking and it got mortally wounded by a mountain lion or something like that, and he just couldn't live it down or forgive himself for it. So that's kind of how he expressed it in the fiction here of just getting eaten alive by a fungus. But it also
Yeah.
seems like grieving for not just pets or people, but in a sense, the entire human race, human civilization. These long time stretch sequences seem to be like musings on the eventual loss of everything. The world is absorbed and sucked into these other bodies as galaxies and solar systems merge and converge. And eventually, all trace that we are ever here at all is going to be gone forever as the
Mhm.
universe disintegrates or collapses or collides or whatever it's going to do in billions of years of time. But I think Hodgson knows that we're not going to be here forever. Not
No.
we as humans, but also the Earth, the solar system, maybe even the Milky Way itself.
Yeah, there's definitely just this sense of overall like an existential dread or like a crisis going on through the book that I definitely kind of felt when I was reading, especially the section when he's going through time so fast. It really does feel that way. It feels kind of just like overall such a sense of melancholy and mourning.
Yeah, he conveys it really well, I think.
So I think it's clear that in the beginning of the book, he is a very cold person, and he's very dismissive of the feelings of other people, and just it very succinctly says the reason we don't keep servants is that I hate them. And it's like, oh, okay, well, fine. So he seems like a real misanthrope, but interestingly, it is true that when a person experiences grief, and I saw a sort of friend of mine post about this on their social media thing not long ago because a mutual acquaintance of ours died a few months ago. And this person said that when these kind of things happen, it makes it so that you feel less inclined to make connections with other people because it makes you vulnerable. And normally when a stranger passes and dies, you feel like you might feel a twinge of something if you hear about it and it seems particularly awful, but you're not personally connected with it in any way. So you don't feel that much. You probably don't feel any grief. But when it's somebody you love, a beloved person or a pet or something like that, you really feel that deep in your core. And certain people can only take so much of that in their life before they become really hard and kind of on their it's a defense mechanism, I guess, of sorts.
Yeah, depersonalization.
I mean, that's why he wants to be at that house so much, because he wants that solitude. He doesn't want to form new connections or new relationships. He doesn't want to go through that sort of feeling again.
Yeah.
And I wonder if maybe the language issue isn't mentioned because maybe everybody around him does speak Irish and maybe he can't communicate with anybody from the village even if he wanted to. Maybe that's a deliberate choice on his part, is to move where he can't be understood, where he can't be interacted with. He has no choice just but to live alone by himself.
Yeah. He wants to be a stranger in a strange land.
Right.
He does, yeah. But I'd notice that as the book goes on, particularly after the astral journey near the end where he sees essentially the death of the universe, he becomes softer. And with that becomes his increased vulnerability, and comes the fact that no longer is he so quick to reach for his guns. Now he's too scared to do anything. Now he thinks about the cat, which we've never heard of before. He even spares a thought of regret for that. He starts thinking about his sister all of a sudden, and he starts actually thinking, why don't we talk to each other properly? Why don't I have anything to do with her? And by then it's too late to do anything about that, and that's even sadder. That's just like, when you reach those conclusions, when you know that your death is so close, right? And it just kind of makes me think, too, like, I mean, we don't know anything about her. He kind of makes her out to be a sort of a simple creature, but, like, if he had confided in her from the beginning, and if she'd been like, okay, I'll help you protect the house, we're going to be good. Like, he could have had a companion in this, maybe.
Yeah.
I don't think things would necessarily have gone better, but it might have been a little easier for him to deal with.
Yeah. It sort of reminded me when he kind of wouldn't tell her what was going on, of like Dracula with Mina, when they just wouldn't tell her what was happening, and that's kind of what led to her being confronted by Dracula. It sort of just, it feels like that to me, but...
Yeah. He kind of brushes her off, like, through the entirety of the house.
Yeah.
And, like, you kind of wonder what she's, like, doing and thinking where he's like passed out for weeks at a time or whatever because he just like was fighting for his life trying to swim out of a hell cave or
right. Yeah, and it's just like all these strange things keep happening, and she's like ministering to his needs and ministering to the needs of the house without much comment, apparently.
Yeah, tends to Pepper.
Yeah. So there was one comment I read online about Pepper, and I was kind of thinking of like, that's interesting because Pepper and the other dog in the last segment have the same wound on them, more or less. So the person had mentioned, well, what if wasn't two dogs? What if the dog at the end was Pepper, and the ending bit is just kind of a hallucination brought on by the fungus that is infecting his brain and kind of making him distort events at the ending segment there. I don't know if I necessarily agree with all of that, but it was an interesting take in how similar the two dogs behave, as he doesn't name the other one, and it just kind of appears out of nowhere.
Yeah, well, he presumably went and got one.
Yeah.
And now he's changed this one up outside rather than having him buy him in the study all the time and stuff like that. I feel it's a different dog just because, I mean, again, the idea of time is a little distorted in this book, but it does seem like as events happen, he is recording them pretty soon after the fact. And right up to the end where he's like suddenly switching to present tense to describe the thing padding into the room, and he's like, oh, I won't have much time left, I should write this down.
Yeah.
Presumably, like the whole cosmic journey thing was written like afterwards. Like that must have been hard to write. Just hard to write all that as a character, like in story. It must have been hard to do, but like it seems fairly immediate. So I think it's not the same dog. But one thing I did wonder though is the wound that Pepper has seems to get better, but the wound the other dog has doesn't. So is it somehow that the threat is more active now, or is it just that, like, so it seems like the swine thing at the end, although it's not really made explicit, it seems like it's like the master swine.
Yeah.
The head honcho of the swine people. Whereas the other ones were more like minor demons kind of thing. And this is the one in the arena that was like, that noticed him first. So then it's like it sent its minions or something, or its minions came to the house after that notice happened.
Yeah, like scouts or something.
Yeah. They didn't have that weird biological infection component at that time, and Pepper was just able to fight it off. But not so with the big one.
There's also this weird, like, green burning fire that it has.
Yeah.
Which the other ones didn't have. They just seem to have, like, basic claws, like a... Well, I don't want to say a normal pig man, but you know what I mean.
A normal, some kind of swine creature, right? Yeah,
just the average one that you can that you encounter in the wild.
Your garden variety demon, right. Right. I don't know. I mean, this one does seem more like it's more powerful and more intelligent, and this one can. The rules of the game are not very clear. I call it the game, but like the rules of the whole proceeding, like. The creatures seem to get in by various means, right? Like sometimes they come from underneath in the pit. And sometimes the things try to get in through the study door, right? And it's like, well, when are they allowed to go through the trap door and not? It's like these things are not made clear. And I guess it's part of he meets his love of the Sea of Sleep. She says the house is governed by grim laws. And we don't really know what these laws are, but it seems like there are certain times or circumstances where it's really easy for them. Like literally at the end, the swine lord just opens the heavy trap door in the cellar and comes up the stairs.
Yeah, because he had barricaded it pretty tightly. Like he had packed a bunch of like wine crates on it or something. I forget what he stacks on it, but it must have been like several 100 pounds. Yeah.
Oh, he did that the first time, and I guess the second time when he went down to look. Like after the flood happened, he went down to look again, and I don't remember. I'm assuming he barricaded it again, but this creature was just able to deal with it like it was nothing, right?
Yeah, and also the creature was able to, have him act on compulsion to open the door that first time when he's going through and trying to take the bars off the door. None of the other swine seem to be able to do that.
Yeah, I don't know. It's like. there's still a lot of things that are not explained, and a lot of, like, again, they have mesmeric powers, but how powerful are they? Like, the other ones, he almost gets hypnotized by the one that looks through the window, but he's able to snap out of it and, like, throw the lamp at it and then break the spell. But obviously, again, this seems to be some kind of, like, avatar or god of the swine things, and at the end, there's no escape. Like, he's so quick to reach for to be on the offensive at every other point. But it's almost like when Pepper dies, especially, like, all the will, all the effort to continue is, like, sapped out of him.
Yeah.
Kind of makes you wonder what would happen if he just would have left them alone to begin with. You know, not sort of firing his gun off at all the chance he gets, not poking around in the mysterious cave, if he had just, like, hung out with his sister and the dog.
I wonder about that, but the thing is, like, the house took him on astral journeys without his volition.
Yeah, right.
So this book does remind me quite a bit of H.P. Lovecraft, right? And I'm going to get to something a bit more specific about that in a minute, but one thing in the story From Beyond, for instance, and I think in other stories too, part of the danger of doing things like reading the Necronomicon or building a machine that allows you to see into other dimensions is that while you're doing those things and you're able to participate in something else, that other thing is also glimpsing you. So the more these cosmic forces, some of which are certainly antithetical to humanity, the more they become aware of you, the more in danger you would be as not just a living organism, but I suppose a soul as well. So one thing that, again, with the Lovecraft connection that I thought was sort of interesting was that there's a lot of circles. Like, there's a lot of, the pit is described as being circular. The house itself is a kind of a circle shape. In Lovecraft's lore, the creature, I guess, the ancient being Yog-Sothoth, which is, like, supposed to be one of the oldest of the... It's one of the truly cosmic beings, unlike like Cthulhu and the Elder Ones that live in the Mountains of Madness and all that stuff. Yog-Sothoth is usually depicted as a series of interconnected circles or spheres. And that being is supposed to be what you invoke if you want access to the greater dimensions and, like, time and, like, other vistas of space that exist beyond the dimensions that we know and stuff like that. So I feel like he was perhaps directly influenced by that, by the way this was written and the way like the geography of the place is, and how, like, there's all these kind of circular patterns and spherical patterns and stuff like that depicted in the book.
The way it's suspended above the pit, too, feels almost otherworldly and, like, impossible geometry that Lovecraft is a really big fan of talking about.
Yeah. Yeah, and, like, the landmarks keep changing, but they're still sort of familiar.
Yeah.
And it's sort of like, it's interesting because, yeah, I thought about that. I thought about, like, so what came first, the chasm or the house? Like, imagine just showing up to this house one day to deliver your goods, and the house is gone. And there's this, like, yawning pit of nothingness there instead.
And I think it may be significant that there is no map of the area because it's perhaps unmappable for that very reason. It is constantly changing in a way that you make a map of the area and a couple years later it's just completely obsolete because it's different now.
Yeah. And of course there's all this great staple of horror fiction, stagnant bodies of water. Right. So Gretchen and I actually met online last week and we watched The Beyond because we were talking about it earlier, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's kind of fun to think that, because there's some pretty direct references. There's the Book of Ibon in that movie, of course, which is a creation of Clark Ashton Smith. And also, yeah, like a place with very strange geography that doesn't quite seem to make sense. And again, stagnant bodies of water that contain something really horrible.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. The Beyond, I don't know.
Yeah, you're not so much of a fan, eh? Gretchen, you enjoyed it, though, eh?
Yeah, I thought it was fun. And there were definitely some over-the-top moments in it, but I'm someone who I like them. I'm someone who's a kind of a sucker, I guess, for stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't mind the movie. I like a lot of parts of it. There's some of it that feels a bit amateurish for somebody who had been making horror movies at that point for like 10 years. Feels like he was a little more concise, and maybe he just had a better cinematographer for some of the earlier ones, but some of the stuff in the
That could
Beyond
be.
just feels a little very silly when it gets put together. But the ending shot of the cool otherworldly dimension is really awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I still have not seen other films by Fulci, so I should check those out sometime.
Yeah, that whole mid-period area, which is like the Beyond, House by the Cemetery, Zombie 2, and City of the Living Dead are all kind of that similar vibe where like a bunch of weird stuff happens for like unclear reasons. The gore is really strong. Not everything makes sense, but it kind of sort of works. I
Yeah.
think a lot of those movies, the Italian cuts do work a lot better because some of the dubbing, especially in House by the Cemetery, is like really bad, and it's just kind of takes you out of the mood. But yeah, I think overall they're enjoyable, but I prefer his earlier stuff. Lizard in a Woman's Skin, in particular, is like a really,
Yeah,
really
but
good movie.
those are different sorts of movies.
They
Like
are.
those are
They are.
not super. They're not really supernatural.
No.
They're not like they are. I guess better in a story sense. But I don't know. Maybe it's just because I've watched it enough times and thought about it a bit and read about it and like read horror fiction that's kind of similar. But I feel like within its internal structure and its internal logic, the Beyond makes perfect sense. It's just there's not a lot of exposition. There's not a lot of explanation. In fact, I think that's part of the whole point is whenever somebody tries to explain something, something really bad happens because the evil in the film doesn't want to be explained.
Right.
So, I don't know. It works for me. It works for me really well. I like it way better than most of the other movies from that period by him, I guess. I mean, I really like Zombie 2 and City of the Living Dead's pretty horrific, but
Yeah.
I don't know. There's something special about that one for me. I really like it. So, but not everybody's going to be a fan. I get that. So,
And I guess it is interesting that this is kind of where you see like the weird stuff, kind of like otherworldly horror in this vein, pick up in movies. A lot of those early Italian ones, including the Fulci ones, are like really more derived from Agatha Christie and Edgar Wallace novels,
oh yeah,
and perhaps one of the stories we'll be reading next time. But this is
Hmm.
very different in tone, and likewise when it's represented in similar movies. I don't know if Fulci specifically had Hodgson in mind, or just kind of otherworldly weird fiction that he possibly could have read.
Right. Somebody in the screenwriting team was certainly familiar with weird fiction because the Book of Ibon is something that was created in Clark Ashton Smith's Hyperborea. So
Exactly, yeah. So I mean, if not Hodgson himself, then somebody tangentially related in the same ballpark.
right.
I really can't think of too many examples of that weird fiction and horror being made before like the 70s. I mean, you get some of the religious movies of like nuns and demons and stuff like that, but to me that
Oh yeah.
has like a much different character than something like
Yeah.
this.
So I don't think any of us know anything about this in particular, but there is a graphic novel version of this story that I thought we should mention.
Yeah, I haven't checked that out, but it would be cool to take a look at. If the
Yeah.
art's well done, I could see that self really lending itself to the medium.
Yeah, I'm a fan of graphic novels, so I'd be interested in checking that out sometime.
Yeah, I wonder what that's like. Maybe if you are able to get a hold of it at some future time, we can talk about it briefly. But it's certainly interesting to speculate like what a visual artist might do to depict this world.
Yeah, and certainly if a network would make a TV show out of this with good animation and special effects and all that, it could be really awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah, a nice miniseries.
Yeah.
Even in like a short serial or something like that. Like even that Astral Journey could just be one part,
Right,
like
exactly.
Yeah.
no dialogue,
Yeah.
just a lot of visual craziness that looks awesome. That would be really something.
And you do get some of that otherworldly weird stuff and some of the big budget TV stuff these days. The new season, I guess it's not new anymore, but the third season of Twin Peaks that came out a couple years ago had a lot of
Oh.
real strange otherworldly stuff in it. In a sense, the concept of the Black Lodge and the White Lodge is very reminiscent of what he's doing here with the Green Star and the Black Star and these two seemingly opposing dimensional worlds being in contact with one another.
Yeah. So another staple of horror fiction, I think, and this is like what I don't know if there's a word for this, but like it's kind of the opposite of like the Tales from the Crypt kind of vibe, where it's like, or even something like Friday the 13th, where like, all right, so I mean, honestly, most of the kids that get killed in Friday the 13th are just like having sex, so there's nothing really wrong with that. But like, we're supposed to think, oh, these people are sort of nasty and they deserve their fate, right? But a lot of the victims of true horror are people who don't deserve it, and people who are just sort of caught in the middle, and they didn't really do anything wrong per se. It's just that horrible things happen to them, and because they didn't do anything wrong, we're especially sympathetic toward them when horrible things happen to them. We're not like waiting for them to die. You know what I mean? Like, we're not looking to see what awesome ways the killer is going to do the thing and finish them off. It's way more like, wow, that shouldn't happen to that guy. Like, that's really unfortunate. And this is certainly an ultimate example of that. Like, even though, yeah, the guy maybe was cold and he was a misanthrope, he had his reasons. He didn't deserve to be in this horrible house, right? And have all these things happen to him, but it just did. And that's like, I think that's really effective. Not to knock the other side, like I like the other kind of thing as well, where it's like almost feels like justice, right? But this is way more effective in a sense because it gets to you in a different kind of way, where it's like it feels really undeserved. And in horror, that's a good thing. This horror is happening, is really horrible things happening to people who don't deserve it.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I think that was a really good discussion about this book, guys. And if nobody has anything further to add, I think we'll move to another contemporary of British weird fiction, Mr. Algernon Blackwood.
Yes.